The Judiciary Committee will come to order, and the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coble, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, General.
Good morning.
General, the FBI, as you know, operates under Attorney General guidelines for most or all of their investigative activities. The objective of these guidelines is the full utilization of all authorities in investigative matters consistent with the Constitution and the laws of the United States. It furthermore ensures that activities must be lawful and reasonable and respect liberty and privacy and avoid unnecessary intrusion into the lives of law-abiding citizens. They enable the FBI to perform its duties with effectiveness, certainty, and confidence. The purpose of these guidelines, it appears apparent, is to establish consistent policy in such matters. General, does the ATF and/or other Department of Justice law enforcement components operate under these guidelines?
There are general guidelines that exist within the department and that control the activities of the various investigative agencies that are part of the department, the Marshal Service, the DEA, the ATF, and the FBI. There might be some that apply specifically to the FBI, given its unique mission with regard to counterterrorism and intelligence, that might not apply to the other components.
I think you may have already answered this one, but are they identical guidelines for identical investigative activity, or may one agency do something that another cannot do under similar circumstances? And if they differ, how do they differ from the guidelines that the FBI, under which the FBI operates?
There are general guidelines that handle or control the way in which investigations are to occur. And for instance, if we're looking at Fast and Furious, those are outside the guidelines certainly that apply to ATF, but they would also be outside the guidelines that would apply to the Drug Enforcement Administration, to the FBI as well. And one of the things that we have tried to do in this reform of ATF and under the leadership of Todd Jones is come up with a whole set of new policy changes and recommendations and rules with regard to how ATF itself can handle and conduct certain investigations.
General, if I had two words to describe Fast and Furious, it would be reckless at best and a disaster at worst. But firearms, I'm told, sold under the Fast and Furious program were included in ATF statistics on the retail sale of firearms and related regulations. Now that we know that ATF apparently skewed the statistics, particularly about long gun sales, will these statistics be scrapped or abandoned?
I don't know if that in fact is true, but the 2,000 weapons or so that were involved in Fast and Furious should not be counted as part of that overall number. And to the extent that that is true, we would pull them out. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, General, have you implemented any policy to end programs such as Fast and Furious? And if these changes, are they permanent or temporary?
Well, as I said, in addition to the things that Todd Jones has put in place that deals with certainly the problems that are, I think, most egregious about ATF, he talks about the way in which surveillance has to occur when you are monitoring trafficking, gun trafficking operations. I released in March of this year a field directive through the Deputy Attorney General that indicated that gun walking, as we've come to call that practice, is prohibited, and made sure that every agent in the Justice Department, every prosecutor in the Justice Department understands that. So it is clear that gun walking is not acceptable, was never acceptable, but is certainly not acceptable after my policy pronouncement in March of this year.
Well, General Holder, earlier this year, August, I believe, you named Todd Jones as the new director of ATF. This appears irregular because he currently continues to serve as U.S. Attorney for that area in Minnesota, while at the same time he's wearing two hats, in other words. Am I missing the mark, or is this irregular?
Yeah, it is irregular. I mean, we have a nominee, a very qualified person who could be the head of ATF. I thought a management change was necessary at ATF, and in the absence of a confirmed head, I had to go with who I thought was best for the organization. Todd's a very experienced prosecutor. He's a great U.S. attorney, but you're right. He is, in fact, wearing two hats. He's working extremely hard, but I think he's made meaningful changes at ATF. He has lifted morale. He has put in place a set of regulations that would prevent the mistakes from the flawed, fast and furious operation, I think, from ever occurring again. But you're right. It is irregular, and given my druthers, I would rather have a confirmed permanent head at ATF.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I see my red light has illuminated, so I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Coble. Another gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Watt, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I had hoped the way my colleague from North Carolina started his questioning that we were going to treat this as a general oversight hearing, which is the way my memo said it was going to be, rather than an inquiry into one single subject. So I want to spend my time asking about some other things unrelated to Fast and Furious, because there are a number of other important things going on in life, and some of those things the Attorney General and his staff have made tremendously good decisions about. One of those is to have all these police chiefs sitting behind you today, one of whom is from my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. And for the members on the Democratic side, at least, they will certainly get to know Chief Rodney Monroe when they come to Charlotte for the Democratic National Convention. So I want to applaud the work that he is doing to prepare us for that significant national event. Perhaps the police chief from Tampa is behind you also. I don't know him. He'll be doing that counterpart work for the Republicans at the Republican National Convention, but that is a massive, massive undertaking, and I know that the Attorney General's office, the Department of Justice, Secret Service, all of the federal authorities are working well based on everything I have heard to prepare for those big security events, and I want to say publicly how much I applaud that. Second, there are a number of things going on an issue that we are dealing with or trying to deal with in this committee, dealing with online piracy, we have some proposed legislation. I won't ask you to comment on that, but I would ask you to comment briefly on the extent of the problem and briefly on what the Department of Justice is doing to try to combat online privacy until we can get the bill passed. And I say comment briefly because I got one other subject that I want to get to related to redistricting and voter suppression and the pre-clearance process under the Voting Rights Act. Perhaps those issues, voter suppression in particular, may not be as important to some of my colleagues on this committee as Fast and Furious and guns, but for a number of people in this country who would like to have the opportunity to vote, they are very serious issues. So why don't I just ask you to comment on what's happening in both of those areas, online piracy and the voter suppression, redistricting, and pre-clearance process.
Okay. We have been, I think, very aggressive with regard to our law enforcement efforts concerning intellectual property concerns. In February 2010, I established the Department's task force on intellectual property. I traveled to China, I guess sometime last year, was at the White House, I think 2 weeks or so ago, to announce a program where I cut some radio spots in addition to television spots that were done by others to talk about the whole question of piracy. And I think we have to understand the significance of it. It is a moral and legal problem there, but it's also a job killer. When things like intellectual property are stolen by other countries, by people in this country inappropriately, it costs jobs. It inhibits creativity. And so we have looked at it in a variety of ways. I work with Victoria Espinel, who heads up the White House effort in this regard, and this is a priority item for us. I'd certainly like to work with you with regard to the bill that you mentioned and see if we can come up with a way in which we put more teeth into our enforcement efforts. With regard to the whole question of voter suppression and challenges, we have filed a number of lawsuits with regard to changes under covered districts covered by the Voting Rights Act. I actually will be giving a speech at the LBJ Library on Monday and talking about this in a more fulsome way. The Justice Department has a responsibility under the Voting Rights Act to look at proposed changes in voting schemes that are in areas covered by the Voting Rights Act, and there's only so much I can say there because we have to act in a neutral way, or almost act as judges in that regard. I can tell you, though, that I am concerned about some of the things that I have seen, without getting into specifics about any one. I was a prosecutor in the Public Integrity Section, and I actually investigated and prosecuted voter fraud cases when I was a young prosecutor, and I'm concerned that some of these changes go far beyond that which exists in terms of vote fraud. I think we need to have some kind of notion of proportionality, and the arc that we have seen over the course of this country has always been to increase the number of people who have the ability to vote, whether it's after the Civil War, the enfranchisement of women. We have always tried to make it easy, and I'm concerned that these recent efforts are going to have a negative impact, and I think ultimately that's not good for our democracy. We want as many people as we can to have their voices heard in the most important way, and that's by casting votes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Watt. The gentleman from California, Mr. Gallagher, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, General Holder. General, I continue to hear from ICE agents, many ICE agents, that they are frustrated that they've had significant difficulty with U.S. attorneys prosecuting worksite enforcement cases. Can you give us specific, and I want to emphasize the word specific, data regarding the number of prosecutions DOJ have accepted and how many they've declined?
Well, if you'll allow me to respond to that after the hearing in a written fashion, I'm sure I can come up with some numbers, but I don't have those numbers.
I can completely understand that, but I would, for the sake of the record of this hearing, appreciate that information as soon as you can get it to us. As everyone clearly understands, welfare fraud is playing a major role in our ability to continue providing service, the level of service that's necessary in Medicare. And the fact that fraud is playing a significant threat as it relates to the solvency of that fund. There have been several estimates that exceed well in excess of $60 billion annually in fraud, and I'm sure you're aware of that. There's also evidence that organized crime, including gangs from Russia and other Eastern European countries and other places as well, that they're finding that filing fraudulent claims is a fast and quick way to make a lot of money, and most of that money is going offshore. Can you give us any detail as to what DOJ is doing in prosecuting these offenders and working with local law enforcement? I've met with my local people in the Los Angeles area. They're very frustrated. How much effort is really being put into, and what success are you having with dealing with the issue of Medicare fraud?
Well, Congressman, you're right to point that out as an issue that is of great concern. It is one that we have tried to focus our attention on. We work with our partners at HHS. Secretary of HHS Sebelius and I have been to a number of places to raise the consciousness of local officials, work with our federal partners to deal with this problem. It is a multi-billion-dollar issue, and given the problems that we have with the solvency of those programs, this is a problem that we have to get a handle on. We have put together what we call these HEAT task forces around the country. I think we're in about 13 cities now. I think that's about right. And that is the way in which we identify the places where we see the greatest amount of fraud. We then deploy these task forces to those places. Interestingly, they prove to be pretty effective, but the problem is the fraudsters tend to move from that site and go to another city. But the concern you raise is a very real one, and it is something that we have to pay attention to, and for which I hope we will receive adequate funding both at HHS and at DOJ.
Well, I appreciate the assessment that many of these are moving on to other cities, but I'm sure it won't come as any newsflash that that isn't necessarily the case in areas like Los Angeles. Now, they may move, but it may be across the street or into another pigeonhole where millions and millions of prescriptions are filled that are never filled, and storefronts that have maybe 150 square feet in them that is providing so-called Medicare benefit or Medicare recipients in the thousands. So how would you describe the level of success you feel that you're having with the resolutions to these folks that you're after? How many are you really, for instance, in Los Angeles, how many major rings have you been able to shut down and put in jail?
Again, I'd have to maybe provide you with some specific information after the hearing with regard to how successful we have been in Los Angeles, but I think the way in which you have described the issue and as these intra-city moves, moving from one place in Los Angeles to another place, this notion of storefronts, exactly describes the problem, where people come in for, well, allegedly come in for services that aren't rendered, and the government is billed for them. Everything from blood transfusions to the use of prosthetics. There are a whole variety of scams that are used, and the way in which you have described it, especially with regard to storefronts. In these strip malls. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we are trying to confront. I will get you the information about
If you'd be kind enough to get us information, I'd like some specificity as it relates to durables, prescriptions, and things such as mammograms to people that have repeatedly received as many as 3 and 4 mammograms in 1 week. I see my time's expired.
I would just say that you've identified something that really has to be a priority for the Justice Department, and I hope that Congress will support our funding requests and HHS's funding requests. The money that we spend in these enforcement efforts, we save huge amounts of money down the road by just investing relatively small amounts of money in prevention and enforcement. It makes the programs that much more financially stable.
I look forward to seeing the data, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gagley.
Mr. Chairman?
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I'd like to renew my request that Mr. Farenthold be able to sit on the dais. Apparently, Mr. Schiff has Mr. Schiff is there, but we have a number of seats that are vacant on this side, and since he won't be asking questions, any position would normally be fine.
Mr. Issa, I talked to the gentleman from Texas, and actually I was just getting ready to recognize him, and he has requested, and I want to recognize the gentleman from Texas, my colleague Blake Farenthold, who's an active member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and he is sitting on the front row. Blake, give us a wave, and appreciate his being here, and he is, I think, happy to observe the committee from where he is sitting.
He looks better on the dais, though, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman.
Okay. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for her questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member for the opportunity. Mr. Attorney General, let me first of all thank you for your service and thank those who are sitting so prominently behind you. I work with chiefs of police as a former judge in my community. I think my former mayor, Mayor Lee P. Brown, was a drug czar, but he was also the head of the Major Chiefs Association. He had the uncanny ability of being mayor and chiefs of police in New York, Houston, and Atlanta. And I noticed our good friend that was formerly the police chief here in the city of the District of Columbia has now moved on to Philadelphia. But I was looking at the timeline, and this will not be my lineage, a total lineage of questioning, but I was looking at the timeline of Operation Fast and Furious. Could you tell me when you were sworn in as the Attorney General of the United States of America?
In February of 2009.
And I noticed that the ATF launched Project Gunrunner in 2005. Were you in the Justice Department in 2005? I don't recollect that you were.
No, I wasn't.
So this is an ongoing program that started, in essence, under the Bush administration.
Well, Gunrunner started under the Bush administration, and Wide Receiver started under the Bush administration. Fast and Furious started under the during the Obama administration.
And then there was some morphing. It is sort of a continuity of sorts, because I think they had sort of the same intent, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. I mean, with the same operations with the same aim, which was designed to stop the flow of guns from the United States to Mexico.
Yeah. I am looking at some news articles, and I am reading some numbers that are absolutely overwhelming. One number says that nearly 40,000 have been killed in gangland drugs warfare. Is that a crisis from your perspective?
It is a crisis of immense proportions. These are 40,000 people killed in Mexico over the last 5 years, but it is a national security concern for the United States of America.
And I think you made it very clear that the horrific infractions, failings of Fast and Furious, you are doggedly, along with the IG on the process, doggedly pointing and looking to investigate what the flaws may have been.
That is correct. I've described it as a flawed investigation, flawed in concept, flawed in execution.
You made the record very clear.
It is something that where mistakes were made, and we have to find out where those mistakes were made, and then I'm going to hold people accountable in that regard.
And likewise, we've offered our sympathy to any fallen officer, but in particular to our fallen officer that was murdered in Arizona.
Officer Terry.
And I offer, as well as we did when we lost an officer that suffered in the Customs and Border and the incident in Mexico that happened as well. That was an issue that we confronted on Homeland Security Committee. I just want to make sure that I offer into the record. You mentioned what we could do in terms of no national gun trafficking law, and I would ask the chairman that our committee begin hearings on that, because we need to be a partner with you. But I'd like to put into the record that we recently passed, Mr. Secretary, H.R. 82, which allows anyone to carry a gun into another state where they have a permit. I see uniform officers behind you. My argument was that this might jeopardize our uniform officers and also violate states' rights. I have here a list of opponents that include 56 major chiefs of police. This bill was passed on the floor of the House. I'd ask the chairman to allow me to put this list again in the record regarding opposing H.R. 822.
And without objection, the document will be made a part of the record.
Let me ask you how that compounds potentially the idea, it hasn't gone to the other body, potentially the damage and the devastation that may impact local chiefs and law departments who are on the streets every day.
Well, the concern that we certainly have with regard to officer safety, something that we have focused on a lot at the Justice Department in the last couple of years. We have seen historic drops in the crime rate. Over the last 2 years, however, we have seen, unfortunately, a tragic rise in the number of officers who have been killed in the line of duty, and we have seen a spike in that rise over the course of this year.
And I'm not going to cut you off. My time is short. I just want to put this comment to my good friend from Wisconsin, who compared this, the most major devastating incident in the Department of Justice since COINTELPRO. I happen to be a person that was on the Select Committee on Assassinations for King and Kennedy as a staffer, and I know full well what COINTELPRO was, and also dealing with the incident in terms of gun running in the Reagan administration. But the point I want to make is when an attorney general covers up a torture memo, I believe that we should not so lightly point to an incident happening in your department where you are fully investigating it. I questioned Attorney General Gonzalez, with great respect for him, over and over again about the happenings in the hospital with then Attorney General Ashcroft, and this was when Gonzalez became Attorney General, regarding the torture memo, which was an enormous international, if you will, incident, and I could never get the truth on that particular set of circumstances. So let us not compare the full investigation that you're engaged in with something worse than we could have ever expected, and I still don't understand who the gentleman was trying to impeach, for this has no basis in the law for any impeachment proceedings, whether he's intending to speak to you or to the President of the United States. And I just wanted to be very clear that we are not in the grandstanding position today. We're in the getting the truth position today, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Mr. Attorney General, you are in the business of getting the truth.
And the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Holder, before turning to Fast and Furious, I'd like to ask you a question regarding an investigation that's taking place in another committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, and that relates to the Solyndra Corporation and their default and bankruptcy and the investigation related to that. The law that set up the incentives for innovative technologies provides for the Secretary of Energy to notify the Attorney General when there is a default on an obligation. This is 22 U.S.C. Section 16512, subsection 4A. If the borrower defaults on an obligation, the Secretary shall notify the Attorney General of the default. Did Secretary Chu ever notify you of that default prior to this becoming the public furor that it has become?
I don't know if something like that has been transmitted to the Justice Department or not.
It requires it be transmitted to you. Are you familiar with such a transmission being relayed to you?
This is not something that I have seen. It doesn't mean, however, that it might not exist someplace in the department. I just don't know.
The reason it's important is that the next section, subsection B, says that on notification, the Attorney General shall take such action as is appropriate to recover the unpaid principal and interest due from, 1, such assets of the defaulting borrower as are associated with the obligation, or 2, any other security pledged to secure the obligation. Obviously, if you're not notified, you're not able to take that action. In addition, that same public law provides in another section that the obligation shall be the subject to condition that the obligation is not subordinate to other financing. Obviously, the fact has been determined that Solyndra did subordinate its obligation to the U.S. To other, and I'm wondering if, given the fact that it appears the law was violated in that regard, if the Attorney General's office is going to investigate what happened there, how it was the Department of Energy allowed that subordination to take place since it required their approval, and if that investigation of who was responsible for that is taking place.
Well, I guess on September the 8th of this year, agents from the FBI and from the Department of Energy's Inspector General's office executed search warrants on Solyndra's offices. There is an ongoing investigation which kind of precludes my ability to speak too much about this matter, other than to say that this is something that we have under active investigation.
Okay, let me just follow up on my first question. Would you take a look and determine whether that notification from Secretary Chu was sent to the Attorney General's office? And if so, when that took place, and would you let the committee know the answer to that question?
Yes, I can get you that answer, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Now, with regard to the Fast and Furious investigation, although the Department has taken steps to ensure that these tactics are never used again, it's certainly an unfortunate reality that we will continue to feel the effects of this flawed operation for years to come, because thousands of firearms were transferred as a part of this program. The guns lost during this operation will continue to show up at crime scenes on both sides of the border. What are you doing to track them down?
Well, I agree with you, and that's what I said in my opening statement and what I said before the Senate last month, that we are going to be feeling the repercussions of those mistakes and the flawed operation for years to come. And you're right, that we will be seeing these weapons in the United States, I fear, certainly in Mexico as well. We are in the process of trying to determine, to the extent we can, where they are, trying to use the tools that we have to seize these weapons.
You know who purchased them, you know when and where they were purchased, and are you aggressively following those leads? Even if some of those people may have been informants and so on, are you attempting to recover through those individuals these weapons?
But we're certainly trying to follow those leads. But one of the flaws in the program.
How many have you recovered?
Of the 2,000 guns, several hundred have been recovered. I don't know what the number is now precisely. That's another number that we can get you. But one of the problems is that once these guns are purchased and they get into the stream of commerce, they become difficult to follow. And one of the problems with the operation is that we don't have all of the information that you'd want to have. But we are trying. I think several hundred weapons have been recovered. I don't know how many are still out there, but your observation is a correct one and one that I agree with. This is an issue that's going to be with us for many years to come.
And begs the question, if they are difficult to follow, why were they ever allowed to get into this pipeline in the first place?
Well, that's the flaw of Operation Fast and Furious. There's no question about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Goodlatte. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Holder, Attorney General Holder, I am trying to sort out some contradictions that are very obvious in this whole discussion about walking guns. And I'm concerned about U.S. Congressman Dan Boren of Oklahoma and Denny Rayburg of Montana, who amended H.R. 1, the fiscal year Continuing Appropriations Act of funding year 2011, to prohibit the use of federal funds for a new regulation currently being proposed by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. From what I can understand, the AFT proposal would require federal licensed firearm dealers to file reports with ATF on all sales of 2 or more semi-automatic rifles within 5 consecutive business days if the rifles are larger than .22 caliber and use detachable magazines. I don't know whether or not this would apply to all of the states or whether or not this would apply to California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. But my real question is, given all of your actions and your opposition to gun walking that started in the previous administration, and the way in which you're trying to make sure that this doesn't happen again, all of the actions that you have taken, why would anyone propose that your hands be tied and that you not be able to have a proposal that would certainly make all of us safer? I live in California, and we're constantly bombarded with the reports of drug lords and the killings that go on there on the border, and the creeping into San Diego and other parts of California. So I'm very supportive of what you have identified by way of containing guns being easily accessible to these drug lords and not allowing gun walking to ever happen again. And so can you discuss with me why your proposal should be adopted by AFT, and what would happen if, in fact, this amendment is Boren of Oklahoma and Denny Rayburg of Montana, if their amendment would successfully get, passed and to the president's desk? How would this hamper your efforts?
Well, I share your concerns. It's one of the things I talked about in my opening statement. It applies only, it's a very reasonable, I think, and limited measure. It only applies to the 4 states that border Mexico. It would provide the ATF with real-time lead information, and it is consistent with what the rules that now exist with regard to the purchase of handguns. Just to give you a dramatic example, if somebody walked into one of these licensed dealers in one of those 4 states without this provision and wanted to buy 100 AK-47s, that information would not be reported to the ATF. The ATF, if that information was reported to them, would have the ability to start making initial determinations as to whether or not there is something we need to be concerned about. But in the absence of that provision, somebody can walk in and over the course of 5 days, whatever number of days, buy as many of these dangerous weapons, so many of which have been used in...
Excuse me, Mr. Attorney General, that was a dramatic statement that you just made. Someone could legally purchase 100 weapons of the sort that you just described, and it wouldn't have to be reported?
Not if this provision were in place, that information would have to be reported by the dealer to the ATF. But in the absence of that, in those 4 states, that would not occur. As long as there was not as long as the guns were not, no, they would not. You would not have to do that.
And you're talking about AK-47s, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I'm using a dramatic example, but that would be accurate.
Well, that's alarming. Are you sure that you have made Mr. Bourne and Mr. Rayberg aware of how they could potentially hamper the ability to get that kind of information that would be so important to ATF?
I mean, it is something that we have certainly tried to share information with members of Congress about. We're in litigation now here in the District Court in Washington, people who are opposed to the implementation of this, I think, very reasonable regulation. It is something that we are prepared to fight for.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm hopeful that there's some way that you can make this absolutely clear to all of the members of Congress, because I suspect there are many members who do not understand what would happen with the Bourne Amendment, and I think it's important that at least we have the facts that, as you have described them. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Waters. The gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, is recognized.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here, Mr. Attorney General. Mr. Attorney General, just for some facts on the table, with respect to the previous quote-unquote gun runner programs, including wide receiver, in those programs, are you aware of whether or not the agents involved were instructed to break off surveillance once the weapons were delivered?
No, they were not, but
isn't that one of the
programs were different in terms of the instructions that were given? The reality is the guns nevertheless made their way in wide receiver to Mexico. So
I understand that. I understand that. I'm not talking about that. But were you aware of that, the wide receiver program? Were you aware of the failure of the wide receiver program before you were aware of the Fast and Furious?
No, I became aware of wide receiver, I guess, during the course of our examination of Fast and Furious.
Anybody under your overall supervision aware of the failure of a wide receiver either prior to the time that Fast and Furious started or during its operation?
Well, we now know that people in the criminal division of the Justice Department were aware of wide receiver, the problems that were associated with wide receiver.
Could you give me any reason why anybody would believe that a program like this would be contemplated with the idea that agents would be instructed to break off surveillance once the weapons were delivered? Isn't that asking for disaster?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't disagree with you that that is a flawed concept, and exactly who did it, why they did it, is something that the Inspector General, I hope, will help.
I understand you got the Inspector General, but you're running a department, and if frankly you passed everything off to the Inspector General before making management decisions about whether people who are responsible for previous decisions should remain in power, frankly, you'd be giving the Inspector General the job to do.
Well, no, I understand that I have...
No, but here's the only reason that I bring this up. You're the one who brought up the question of the previous administration. And okay, you want to do that. But let's talk about the distinction between those programs. That was not gun walking in the terminology that most people think. When you talk about a controlled delivery, even though you can go to the dictionary and say controlled delivery means you just control it to delivery, the parlance of controlled delivery in previous programs meant that you followed it afterwards. Now, they screwed up because they found that those indicators that they had that were supposed to let them know where the weapons were, the bad guys figured that out. But I would hope that, I mean here's my problem. I mean, when I became a congressman this time around, people said, what's the difference between being Attorney General of California and being a congressman? I said, well, after I finish a meeting, I don't have to go out and face reporters who ask me about something one of my 5,000 employees has done that I don't know anything about. And I know you have more than 5,000 employees. But that was my internal thought. The fact of the matter is I'm responsible. I was responsible for what they did, and you're responsible for what these folks did. And the frustration I have is this. And maybe it's unfair, so maybe you can help me with this. After all this time, we still don't know, because the Inspector General is looking at it, we still don't know who knew what when and who made the decisions. And that doesn't give much confidence to the American people, particularly when CBS reports that there is a memo from AFT Field Operations Assistant Director Mark Shayet emailed Bill Newell, I guess Newell, with this, quote, Bill, can you see if these guns were all purchased from the same licensed gun dealer and at one time? We're looking at anecdotal cases to support a demand letter on long gun municipal sales. Thanks. I've got to deal with people in my district who are law-abiding citizens who believe in the Second Amendment, who say to me, look, the feds are overreaching all over the place, and here you got a situation where they screwed up. They're the ones responsible for hundreds, if not thousands, of weapons going to Mexico. People are dying, including some of our law enforcement agents, and yet they're using that as an excuse to extend their reach in the law. Now, either this memo, are you aware of this memo, July 14th, 2010, from Mark Chait to Bill Newell?
No, I'm not aware of it.
Would you think that'd be appropriate?
Well, I think what you're taking a memo and taking it, I think, out of context.
Sir,
the operation.
I'll give you a chance to answer, but I'll tell you why I don't think I'm taking it out of context. This is in direct reference to the guns that were all involved in Fast and Furious, and then you have someone under your direction, not saying you direct them to do it, but someone who's under your authority, saying, let's use this stuff. Maybe it's going to help us. I don't know if it's going to help us at a hearing, but it's going to help us try and get our new policy through. And then I'm trying to respond to law-abiding citizens who believe in the Second Amendment, who say, you got the federal government who screws up sending thousands of weapons south. They're using that as an excuse why they should put more restrictions on us. So how do I respond to that in a way that is fair based on the facts when so far I've heard, I'm sorry, Mr. Congressman, I can't tell you because the Inspector General is looking at it.
Well, let me deal with both of those things. First, that the Inspector General has a responsibility that I've asked her to assume, and that is to do an independent investigation of that. That will take time. That does not, however, lessen the responsibility that I have as the head manager of the Justice Department to take steps where that is appropriate. And I have taken steps. I have made personnel decisions. I am prepared. Those were initial determinations that I've made, and I'm prepared to take other steps before the Inspector General reports back. I think that will be, her conclusions, her findings will be useful for me in trying to make ultimate determinations, but I don't need the Inspector General to make certain determinations that I will make. With regard to the question of that memo and the long gun rule, the ATF reached out to the field to obtain examples of cases or operations where that kind of a rule would have been helpful. Now, the operation known as Fast and Furious was one of 7 cases that were already underway that ATF later cited as an example to illustrate the potential benefit of collecting information about the multiple sales of certain types of rifles. So this was already underway when that...
I understand, but you would see how some people might reasonably come to the conclusion that's sort of self-dealing. The department creates a situation in which weapons go south across the border in the hundreds, if not the thousands, and then uses evidence of the fact that that occurred to support their effort to try and extend the reach of the law.
Okay.
That's my question.
Congressman, but with all due respect, I mean, take a step
The
back.
gentleman from California is recognized for an additional 30 seconds, so the Attorney General can answer the last question.
And I say this with all due respect. Take a step back and think about the implications of what you're saying, is that the Justice Department came up with a flawed program in order to justify a regulation. And given all that has flown, that comes from...
Well, I'm talking about after the fact. After the fact. You screwed up, you ought to admit you screwed up, but you ought not to use your screw-up as a basis for trying to extend your authority. That's my point. I'm not trying to talk about a conspiracy. I'm talking about a responsible action after the fact. When you screw up, you ought to say you screw up. The people who are involved ought to say they screwed up, and then don't allow your screw-up to be the basis for trying to extend your legislative agenda. That's all I'm saying.
All I'm saying is that, as I said, there were 7 cases. These things were already underway when that information was sought.
Thank you, Mr. Lundgren. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Attorney General Holder, for being here today. There is a hole in our gun control laws that is so large that you could drive or fly a space shuttle through it. And it's called the gun show loophole. And what that gun show loophole enables unlicensed firearms sellers to do is to sell an unlimited amount of firearms per year or per gun show to anybody without having to perform a background check as a licensed gun dealer must. And so we've got gun shows, thousands of gun shows per year being held throughout America, and we've got untold numbers of licensed gun dealers who are selling their wares at those gun shows, and you have untold thousands of unlicensed private weapons dealers who are selling firearms, including automatic assault rifles of the type that walked away in Operation Fast and Furious. How many automatic assault rifles walked away during Fast and Furious?
I think the number that has generally been reported is about 2,000.
It's about 2,000. Now, how many firearms are sold to al-Qaeda terrorists, to other convicted felons, to domestic violence perpetrators, to convicted felons, to white supremacists? How many unlicensed gun dealers, or let's say how many weapons, how many assault rifles, let's just say in a given year, are sold to such individuals by unlicensed gun dealers at these gun shows that are unregulated, and how many of those end up walking away to Mexico? Can you give us a number on that?
I don't have a number on that. I can certainly endeavor.
Would it be more than a couple of hundred?
I'm pretty certain it would be more than 2,000, but in terms of getting those numbers for you, I can try to do that and provide you with those numbers after the hearing.
Do you, it would seem to me that with the thousands of gun shows and unknown numbers of private gun owners selling an unknown number of weapons, including assault rifles, to unknown people. It would seem to me that there's a fair possibility that a whole lot more than 2,000 weapons would walk out of the gun show and find their way into the hands of a Mexican drug cartel. Would you agree with me on that?
Again, without knowing the numbers, I wouldn't want to guess, but I think that one of the things we need to focus on is to know who actually is buying weapons, who is.
And we don't have that ability right now with that gun show loophole, correct?
We don't have it across the board. And
okay, and now let me ask you this question. Over the last 5.5 years, we've had 5 acting directors of the ATF. How does the Senate's failure and refusal to confirm a nominee for that important agency, what effect does that have on the ability of that agency to be guided in a way so as to avoid the kind of situations like Fast and Furious?
Well, I think that's actually a very good point. When you have a confirmed head, there's a certain prestige that goes with that demarcation. But beyond that, it allows a person to have a longer term, to have a certain consistency, to put in place programs, to put in place controls that did not exist and that allowed Fast and Furious to happen. What Todd Jones has done as the acting head of ATF in a relatively short period of time, I think is fairly remarkable. It would be a better thing if we had somebody in his place who had a confirmed was a confirmed person and could extend the time that he would spend or she would spend running the organization. Todd is still the head of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota, and I can't expect him to devote 4 years, for instance, as somebody might if they were a confirmed head and served a full presidential term, to do the same thing. And that consistency, that presence for an extended period of time has, I think, a huge positive impact on an organization.
You think the NRA and other Second Amendment rights radicals have confidence that the U.S. will not have a competent ATF head if the Senate continues to deny a leader for that organization, thus rendering it rudderless? Is politics causing that, you think?
I mean, it certainly has a negative impact on the organization. There are certain groups that I think have actively opposed nominees, both put up by President Bush as well as President Obama, who I think were amply qualified to lead the organization and who, for whatever reason, were not confirmed.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. The gentleman from California, Mr. Ice, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd be remiss if I didn't take exception to calling the NRA members, the millions of them, radicals. I think that's an offensive statement beneath contempt in this committee. Mr. Attorney General, will you agree to come before the Oversight Committee without the need for a subpoena in the January timeframe? I will not. Mr. Attorney General, will you agree to come before the committee I chair, the Oversight Committee, the one you've produced these documents to, in the January timeframe without the need for a subpoena?
I will consider it, but I will note I've testified on 4 occasions with regard to this matter. I've appeared before you at least on 2 occasions.
You've appeared before this committee. Your organization pushed back on the request for a joint hearing here today. Not will you consider it, but do I need to serve a subpoena on yourself and Lanny Brewer and the other people under direct investigation of my committee, or will you agree to come voluntarily in the January timeframe before the committee?
I will consider any request that you make.
I thank you, Mr. Attorney General. I now would go to the questions of emails. This is the documents you refer to. Most of these documents, 5,000 or so, are in fact emails. Mr. Attorney General, I have a question for you. Not one of these emails, in fact, is yours. Aren't you a prolific emailer?
No.
Don't you email?
Yes.
Do you have a personal email account, and as well as an Attorney General's email account?
I have an email account at the Justice Department, yes.
Do you have a personal email?
Yes.
Do you regularly email to Lanny Brewer, your former partner, and your head of criminal division?
No, I wouldn't say regularly. There are only a limited number of people who know my email address in the Justice Department.
Well, let me cut to the chase. Don't you think it's a little conspicuous in his absence that there's not one email to or from you related to Fast and Furious in any way, shape, or form?
There are a variety of reasons why the emails that we have shared with you are there. We have shared in an unprecedented way email information that no Justice Department, no Attorney General has ever authorized before. You have deliberative information contained, I guess.
But isn't it true that executive privilege does not flow to the Attorney General, only to the Office of the President? So deliberative process within your department, running law enforcement, in fact, doesn't serve executive privilege. As the chairman said going on, you haven't cited any reason that these would not have been delivered.
In making production determinations, we have followed what attorneys general in the past have always used as applicable standards, and these are Republican as well as Democratic attorneys general, and the information that we have provided to you has been responsive, has been, I think, fulsome, and also has been unprecedented.
Well, unprecedented would be an attorney general who knew nothing about something where his own DAG, now his present chief of staff, was intimately familiar. Gary Grindler was well aware, according to documents provided, of Fast and Furious on March 12, 2010. Are you aware of that? That he was aware of Fast and Furious and what its procedures were on March of 2010?
It was certainly brought to his attention as part of a regular briefing that he got from ATF, but he did not hear during that briefing anything about the tactics.
Really? Is that why in his own handwriting, when he talks about going to stash houses, he clearly understood in a document you've delivered, he clearly understood in his own handwriting what the tactic was. I'm sorry, but I'm going to ask you a different question.
Well,
because he understood. No. Look,
can I answer that question?
You've answered it less than truthfully.
Chairman, could the questioner allow the witness to answer the
Madam,
question?
this is my time. I am not yielding.
I'm not asking you. I'd appreciate it.
The gentleman
I'd
from
appreciate
California,
it if you would
Mr.
allow
Issa,
the
has
witness
the
to
time.
answer the question.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Issa,
I understand
has the
that.
time. The gentlewoman from Texas has
I'd
not been
appreciate it if the
recognized.
witness could be allowed to answer the question, Mr.
The gentleman
Chairman.
from Texas has not been recognized.
I ask
The
for
gentleman from
a
California
sense of protocol here.
The gentleman from California has the time.
Mr. Attorney General, as I was saying, Mr. Grindler, you can't answer on his behalf, and so it makes no sense to. This is evidence that was delivered. Do you regularly talk to your chief of staff, and do you regularly receive oral briefings from Mr. Grindler? And in fact, when you made the decision to have him be the DAG and then the chief of staff, wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that if he knew on March 10th, as this document indicates, that you would also know? March 10th. March of 2010, March 12th of 2010.
Well, first, he was not made intimately familiar with the program as a result of that briefing. The briefing that he received from then Acting Director Melson did not go into the tactics. Melson indicated.
Of course, it didn't go into the tactics. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that I have the time restored that I lost with the lady's interruption.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional minute, and also to give the opportunity to the Attorney General to respond to the question.
I certainly look forward to that. Mr. Attorney General.
I was in the middle of an answer, I think.
You know, you're in the middle of filibustering, so I'll let you answer. I have two more things to quickly go over, and then you can have all the time the chairman will give you. Does it surprise you that these boxes, 5 boxes, represent just what one gun dealer gave us voluntarily? Well, in fact, this seems to be all the information you have responsive to our subpoena. Does it cause you to think that, in fact, we believe you were withholding documents? We believe that, in fact, there is more production. So my final question, and you can answer all of them for as long as the chairman wants, is do you today have documents responsive to the lawful request of the Oversight Committee that have not yet been granted?
All right, well, let me go back to my first answer that I was not...
Well, mine's pretty easy. Mine's a yes or no, and then the others you're going to go on for a while.
I'll get to that.
Would you please get to it first?
To Gary Grindler, he was not provided with a detailed analysis of Fast and Furious. He was given information about
Mr. Chairman, I asked earlier that the Attorney General be placed under oath. I was denied that. But what I will make the point is that it is not productive for anyone to come before this committee and tell us what somebody else didn't know. That is exactly how the legislative liaison behind the Attorney General, Mr. Weish, came and gave false testimony to my committee, false because people who are still working for the Attorney General knowingly gave him misleading information in addition to the U.S. Attorney, and no action has been taken.
Is the gentleman's time been extended, or is there regular order?
To the Chairman, I might note for the record that the IG...
I have a parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman...
I have a parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from California continues to be recognized, and let me make a point in the record that he is not over time near as much as the gentlewoman from Texas was a few minutes ago. So let's
I thank you for your courtesy, but I would like to understand whether the gentleman has extended time.
And he was recognized for that purpose, as the Attorney General will be recognized for the purpose of responding.
And will he allow the Attorney General to answer the question?
I look forward to it.
Thank you very much, my colleague.
Mr. Chairman, I'll use only 5 more seconds. The fact is the Inspector General has released information that was secret to the object of our investigation with the knowledge of the Justice Department. She is not currently, in our opinion, qualified to investigate, and in fact has overstepped the line by delivering secret tapes to the object of our investigation while the Justice Department was slow-rolling that discovery, and this is the ATF agent that was intimately involved with this. Okay. So I want you to understand, I have treated this Attorney General as a hostile witness because ultimately, while he comes before us saying he's going to clean house, no house has been cleaned.
Gentleman's time has expired, and the Attorney General will be given the opportunity to respond.
I'll try again. Gary Grindler was not provided with information, as you've described, intimate information about Operation Fast and Furious. He was not told about the tactics that were used there. The person who did the briefing was the acting head of ATF, and he has, I understand, testified before your committee that he did not, in fact, share that tactical information with Mr. Grindler. I note that Mr. Melson also briefed you, Congressman, about a month or so later, or before, I forget which, and he said at that time he did not share with you information about those tactics. So the notion or your contention that Gary Grindler was familiar with this or intimately familiar with this is inconsistent with what I think the facts are. And you take me to task for trying to assume what I know Grindler to have said. You have not interviewed him as well, and nevertheless you feel comfortable doing the same thing. With regard to the documents that you talked about, we have not withheld any documents that are responsive to the matters that you have asked us about. We have withheld information that pertains to ongoing investigations. That is the thing that might have limited our document production. But again, what we produced on February the 4th is unlike anything that any committee in any part of this Congress, Senate or House, has ever seen before. And I want to make clear, as we said in that letter, that is not precedential. I'm not holding, and I don't think any future Attorney General should be expected to do that, but given the nature of what we did in withdrawing that February 4th letter, it seemed to me to make sense to make an exception to what has been a long recognized rule.
Mr. Chairman, could the AG be allowed to fully answer, since it was pursuant to a subpoena, whether or not his answer about did he provide
the gentleman's time has
means
expired.
He was withholding or not withholding? He didn't answer.
Does the Attorney General wish to add anything?
Mr. Chairman, that would require unanimous consent. I withhold.
The gentleman has not been recognized. I was asking the Attorney General a question. Does the Attorney General wish to respond any further to the questions?
I'm fine.
Okay. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, is recognized for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Holder, a lot has been made about the letter written by your Assistant Attorney General, Mr. Ron Weish. Nobody expected him or believes that he has any personal knowledge of the information, but expected him to get the information and relay it. The information has, I think, been subsequently determined to be false. Do you know where he got the false information?
The information that was contained in that letter, the incorrect information that was contained in that letter, was derived from people in the field who had the operational responsibility for Operation Fast and Furious, both from the ATF in Phoenix as well as the U.S. Attorney's Office in Phoenix. That information, I think, logically was presumed to be accurate. That information was transmitted to people in Washington who put the letter together. And if you look at the February 4th document production that we made, you can see how this went back and forth and how the letter was actually put together. It turned out that the people in Phoenix had information that was not, in fact, accurate, and that is the stuff that found itself into the February the 4th letter.
Now, what did you do when you found out that the information was not accurate?
I couldn't hear you.
What did you do when you found out that the information was not accurate?
Well, one of the things that I did early on was to ask the Inspector General to look into this. I was hearing from inside the Justice Department one set of facts. I was hearing from members of Congress and members of the media something else. And it seemed to me that given this disparate information that I was receiving, that an investigation needed to be had. And on February the 28th, I asked the Inspector General to begin an investigation.
An article in USA Today says, quote, the program, referring to Fast and Furious, was fundamental, which Holder has finally acknowledged was fundamentally flawed, occurred with the knowledge and approval of justice. Do you want to respond to that statement?
That is not true. I mean, the notion that people in the in Washington, the leadership of the department, approve the use of those tactics in Fast and Furious is simply incorrect. This was not a top-to-bottom operation. This was a regional operation that was controlled by ATF and by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Phoenix.
There's a memo dated November 16, 2007, about a meeting of the Attorney General in 2007 with the Mexican Attorney General that says, of particular importance, ATF has recently worked jointly with Mexico on the first ever attempt to have a controlled delivery of weapons being smuggled into Mexico by a major arms trafficker. While the first attempts at this controlled delivery have not been successful, the investigation is ongoing. Does that suggest to you that guns were so-called walking in 2007?
Well, certainly not walking in the same way that they were allowed to walk in Fast and Furious, but the reality was guns did find their way into Mexico in an inappropriate way. And one thing that I want people to understand is that I don't know what attorneys general did back then and how they reacted to it, but I can tell you what this Attorney General did. I asked for an Inspector General investigation. I sent out a directive to the field that this kind of activity was inappropriate. I made personnel changes, and I am overseeing, with the help of Todd Jones, substantial reforms at ATF. I was very active in dealing with this issue. You can look at what other Attorneys General did.
Thank you. Switching subjects, the last administration was cited for political hiring within the Civil Rights Division. Have you continued that political hiring in violation of the law?
We hire people within the Civil Rights Division on the basis of their experience, their commitment to that which the Civil Rights Division has historically stood for, people who are going to be good litigators, people who are going to work hard. We don't hire people on the basis of political or ideological affiliations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of other questions, and I'll be
Would the gentleman yield for a moment? Gentleman yield.
For the record, and I'll yield the balance of the time.
Thank you very quickly, Mr. Chairman. I would like to put into the record the Examiner, Mexico losing its war on drug cartels, and the Los Angeles Times that says how many have died in Mexico's drug war. Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry.
Yes, unanimous consent.
I ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
I yield back.
Thank
The
you.
gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Attorney General Holder, for coming here to testify. A number of questions that come to mind as I listen to the responses that are here, and they sort down to this. as near as I can determine, have you identified the weapon that actually killed Agent Terry?
That would go into a ballistics report determination, and I'm not prepared to talk about that given that it's a pending case.
It's still under investigation, but there's some data there that is being examined by justice?
There are, as I said, there is an ongoing investigation. There's a case that has been indicted, and obviously a part of that trial will be the ballistics report.
Have you identified a suspect or a person of interest?
Somebody has been indicted in connection with that case.
Somebody has been. And that's not information that you can speak to today?
Okay, there are some rules there that don't allow me to do it. Apparently this is a matter that is under seal.
So but there has been an indictment.
Yes, there has been an indictment.
Thank you. And if you were to tell us who that was, you couldn't do so in this setting?
That's correct.
If we were in an executive session, could you do that?
I don't think so. I think it is a court-ordered seal.
Okay, that's satisfactory to me.
We'd have to seek leave of the court in order to do that.
That's satisfactory. Thank you. Do you have a sense or an estimate or data on the numbers of Mexicans that have been killed or homicides, investigations that have brought about deaths where there have been weapons used that are from Fast and Furious in Mexico? We lost Agent Terry. How many Mexicans do you estimate have died because of the weapons that have been sent to Mexico?
I don't know that figure, Congressman King, but I fear that the number of people on the Mexican side of the border, frankly as well on the United States of the border, who will be negatively impacted by the mistakes of Fast and Furious are going to be people who are going to be harmed. I don't have any numbers, but I fear that is what is going to happen, has probably already happened, and is likely to happen in the future.
Do you have, though, reports or data that would give you some sense of that? Is it a report that's delivered to you in your briefing that when we know all about we know about Agent Terry, but I'm thinking about this from a public relations standpoint. I'm thinking that if this happened in the United States, and I'm going to guess that there are multiple deaths in Mexico, if there's anything proportional to the distribution of the weapons, are there any reports that give you a sense of this happening? Is the communication going back and forth across the border and identifying Fast and Furious weapons that may have been used in crimes and homicides in Mexico, so that you have a sense of that number?
I don't have a sense of that as yet. I mean, we certainly work with our Mexican partners to try to trace guns that are seized in connection with crimes. That's why I said, we've traced 64,000 of those guns over the last 5 years. My guess will be that we will trace some guns over the coming years and months back to Fast and Furious, and then we'll be able to connect those traced weapons to crimes that have occurred in Mexico. But to date, I have not received information like that.
Well, thank you. I'd like to just shift a little bit. I know the last time you were before this committee, May 3rd of this year, as I recall, we had a discussion about the Pigford Farms issue, and I submitted a series of questions to about that, and you've answered most of those questions in writing as of a date, I think it was October of this year. And so I'd like to narrow in on that a little bit, because of the Pigford Farms issue, you cite as the authority for justice and presumably USDA to negotiate with black farmers, the authority that's in the Farm Bill, commonly known as the Farm Bill, and you cite the sections of the bill. And I will just tell you in this committee that I had a conversation with the then chairman of the Ag Committee, Colin Peterson, on the way over to the floor to vote on this Farm Bill, and I said to him, the authorization that you've granted in the Farm Bill, which you cite in your response, will open up the door to $1.3 billion in additional Pigford claims. And his response to me was, no, that $100 million caps the spending on settling all outstanding Pigford claims. You will be satisfied with the results of that. That was our disagreement. And I've had the Secretary of Agriculture cite the same section that you have cited. I have this section before me, and I'll ask unanimous consent to introduce it into the record at the conclusion. But it says here that shall not exceed $100 million, and it shall be construed to effectuate its remedial purpose of giving a full determination on the merits of each Pigford claim previously denied that determination, which is the language that opened up Pigford 2. So I'll submit that the authority only exists to resolve all outstanding Pigford claims and cap them within $100 million. And we got a claim coming back to Congress for an additional $1.15 billion, and I have, I have no information in my letter that tells me how many claims you have from Pigford, and I don't have any information that tells me what was spent on attorney fees in the settlements of Pigford 1. So I'd appreciate if you could respond to that.
Sure. We'll get you that information.
And including the value, the cost to attorney fees in Pigford 1, and anything that's current.
Whatever information we have with regard to the questions you've asked, I'll make sure that we get passed on to you.
And I would just ask then in follow-up, have you had
time has expired.
If I'd ask unanimous consent to complete my question.
The gentleman continues to be recognized for a final question, and then the AG to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just ask that we know that there were negotiations, according to your letter, that took place between the Department of Justice, the USDA, and representatives of the black farmers, which sounds to me in their response to be multiple organizations, multiple entities. So I would ask you if you personally had a conversation with Secretary Vilsack with regard to Pigford, and who are those entities that were negotiated with to come to this settlement that I contend goes beyond the $100 million cap that was authorized.
Well, I have certainly talked about this matter with Secretary Vilsack, the person who's primarily responsible for the settlement of the case on the Justice Department side is the Associate Attorney General Tom Pirelli. There were a variety of organizations, entities, individuals who were engaged in this. I mean, we were trying to work out a settlement short of litigation, so people who were potential plaintiffs were part of these conversations to reach this agreement.
Thank you, Mr. King.
Thank you. Gentleman
from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Holder, I kind of understanding this issue some, but it's a great tragedy this agent was killed, and it'll be a year next week, as I understand it. And it was a fast and furious weapon that he was killed by, as I understand it. Is there any great difficulty in Mexico for folks who are part of these drug cartels, or folks to get guns? Are guns rather plentiful in Mexico in general?
I think we can safely say that they are readily available, and the part of the problem with their ready availability is the fact that so many guns flow from the United States to Mexico. As I've said, over the last 5 years, at least 64,000 weapons traced to the United States that were found in Mexico, and those are only the ones that were traced. There are undoubtedly additional guns in Mexico that have not been traced back to the United States.
So while it's a supposition, I would presume that if Fast and Furious didn't occur, that the individuals that committed this this violent act, and it resulted in the death of the agent, they would have probably had weapons anyway.
You know, you can never suppose. I mean, but for is always hard to determine. But I don't think that's an illogical conclusion that the people who were involved in that senseless, tragic, awful murder probably could have had access to other weapons.
I kind of remember the president of Mexico saying something about most of the guns that come there come from the United States. And I think he also said something about most of the market he has for marijuana comes from the United States, too. So we supply him with guns and a market. We could certainly dry the market up, but that's the job of the Judiciary Committee, I realize. What are we doing to try to stop guns from going into Mexico? Are there efforts at the border to stop guns from traveling from this country there?
Well, we have moved people to the border. We work with our partners. The Justice Department works with our partners at DHS to try to come up with ways in which we inspect cars that are going from the United States to Mexico. We have teams of agents that work together to try to determine ways in which we can stop the flow of guns. We use a variety of intelligence methods that I can't really get into to try to determine if cartels are trying to bring into Mexico huge stashes of guns. But we also need to use things on this side of the border, and that's one of the reasons why that long gun rule, I think, is so important. If we see substantial numbers of these long guns being purchased, it gives the ATF real-time leads that they can follow to see if, in fact, these are legitimate purchases or they are purchases by people intending to have those guns shipped to Mexico.
Coming home, which is where I think the real issues are, not to say that they're not important about the border and all, but in our cities, we've got a lot of youth violence and gangs, and I want to commend you for having a national forum on youth violence prevention, and included Memphis in the forum. Can you give the committee some information about what you've done to help inner cities fight youth violence and gang activities?
Well, one of the things I want to say is that the 5 police chiefs behind me from Charlotte, Detroit, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Boston have all embraced, and we've learned from them, the way in which we deal with this issue of youth violence. That it is not simply a question of doing what is traditional law enforcement, that we have to come up with ways in which we deal with the underlying problems that involve our young people in these antisocial behaviors. Congressman Scott has been, I think, very forward-leaning in this regard with legislation that he has proposed and that we support. We've tried to deal with these underlying causes, and it's been particularly useful to have our partners in law enforcement identify with and be participants in these preventive activities, in addition to all the great things that they do on the enforcement side. And the thing that you've talked about, what we're doing in Memphis, is an example of the kinds of things that we are trying to do in the Obama administration.
I would like to, Mr. Chairman, to comment that the gentleman from Philadelphia, I believe the chief, I recognized you, and I kept thinking, where do I know you from? And where I knew you from was when you testified before this committee on the bill to allow folks who had gun permits to travel from state to state based on federal edict rather than state cooperative agreements. And at the time, I was a sponsor of the bill that ended up passing, but because of your testimony and law enforcement's objections, as well as my belief in states' rights, I changed my position, came off as a sponsor, and voted against the bill. Your testimony was effective, and it's nice to see you again, and I thank you for that. I yield back the remainder of my time to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert, is recognized.
Mr. Franks. Yeah, Mr. Franks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Attorney General, for being here. We do appreciate the law enforcement being here. We've had multiple of our Democratic friends point out their presence, and we do appreciate the job you do. I thought, and everybody needs friends, and I'm glad you're supporting the Attorney General. I thought about inviting the law enforcement that's furious over Fast and Furious, but there's just not room in this room or the building, so I didn't do so. Let me ask you, Attorney General, have you read the opinion from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals on the Holy Land Foundation trial? It came out yesterday.
No, I have not seen that.
All right. Well, we know from prior documentation that there's been a relationship with CARE and the Justice Department. Is there any ongoing relationship, any reach out at this time still to CARE?
Well, we certainly reach out to a variety of Muslim groups as we try to...
Well, I'm talking specifically about CARE.
No, I was getting there. But I don't think that we have any particular outreach efforts at this point with CARE.
You know, there was a partnership between the FBI and CARE, and in 2009 it was temporarily suspended. I didn't know if there was still informal outreach to CARE. Because we do know from this opinion yesterday, we know from the prior Fifth Circuit opinion, when CARE and ISNA and others tried to have their names struck as named co-conspirators, that it was unsuccessful. The Fifth Circuit basically saying there's a case there to prove. And then, as we know, you decided not to pursue those, or your department did, as we've talked about before. In the decision yesterday, the the court said that the Palestine Committee created not only the Holy Land Foundation, but a number of other Islamist entities in the U.S. Leaders of one of those entities, the Islamic Association for Palestine, subsequently created CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, which was cited as an indicted co-conspirator. So it does create some concerns. We know there was massive number of documents being furnished to the defendants in that case, a lot of production of documents. But I would like to ask that we get copies of the documents that were provided to the 5 defendants who are now convicted and affirmed by the Fifth Circuit. Would the Justice Department make those documents available?
I'm not sure I know what documents you're talking about. If they were provided in litigation.
Correct.
And if we can provide them, I'm sure that we would. I don't know if there are documents that have been provided in discovery that we don't have the ability to provide. I just don't know the answer to that.
Well, they have been furnished by your department to the defendants in the case. Those defendants have now been found guilty of providing support to terrorism. There's no question in my mind that those documents are now in the possession of terrorists. And so we have had trouble getting production of all the documents that we have desired and requested. And I didn't think that there should be any problem with privilege or anything of that nature, since the defendants who are convicted of supporting terrorism have them, the terrorists have them, and I just felt like it'd be a good idea for Congress to have them. These are.
I'll certainly take that request under advisement, and to the extent that we can provide documents.
Well, I hope that we will have as good a standing as the terrorist supporters that have been convicted. I'm familiar as a judge handling massive litigation, been in MDL with a document dump. About 100 of these are just Grassley's letters, but I want to ask you, since you had said before in your statement that you asked the Department Inspector General to investigate this Fast and Furious matter, in March you ordered a directive be sent to law enforcement prosecutor prohibiting such tactics, and in this entire stack is not an email, not a letter, not a transcript of a speech, nothing from you. I would ask where they are. If you did those things in February and March, where are they? And not only that, you testified May 3rd in here, as we recall, that you had just learned about Fast and Furious a few weeks before. And now you say, actually, in February and March, you made these orders. When was the first time after May the 3rd you began to suspect that you may have actually taken actions in this case?
Well, I actually took actions well before May the 3rd, on February the 28th.
Well, unless you were intentionally misrepresenting the facts on May 3rd, which I'm not contending at all,
no.
Then at some point you began to wonder, gee, I believe I issued some orders in this matter. We haven't seen the orders. All we have is the transcript here. We know you're capable of mistakes, as you've verified. Where are the emails, letters, orders? Where are they from February and March?
All right, well, there are a couple of things going on here. I mean, I didn't play any role in the drafting of the February 4th letter. With regard to the notion of...
So you were not the one that ordered the inspector...
The gentleman's time has expired. The AG will be allowed to answer the last question.
With regard to the question of what I said on May the 3rd about a few weeks, I mean, I said a few weeks about when I first learned about Fast and Furious. I learned about Fast and Furious when this became a matter of controversy, I think sometime at the beginning of the year, and my guess is probably about the middle of February, which would have been about 10 or 12 weeks before I said a few weeks. Now, I could have said, you know, a couple of months. Maybe I should have been more precise, but a few weeks from my perspective was accurate then, and it still seems to be accurate now when I say a few weeks, 10 or 12 weeks, but I think be encompassed in that description.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that he be allowed to actually answer the question of whether or not he's the one that actually ordered the Inspector General to investigate that, and if so, where the documentation of it.
Okay.
That was my question.
And has the AG answered or responded?
I'll answer. I was, in fact, the person who requested ordered the Inspector General to begin this investigation. I don't think I did that in any written form. I think that was transmitted from me either through my Chief of Staff, through the Deputy Attorney General, to the IG. There might be a writing that exists in that regard, but I don't think that I signed off on anything actually. I have a good relationship with the Inspector General. The Inspector General's office had looked at this whole question of gun trafficking before, and it seemed logical to ask them to expand their inquiry and look into Fast and Furious. As I said, I don't think there's any writing from me, but I can check that. But I don't think there's any writing from me that exists with regard to.
Well, we'd sure ask for a copy if any such exists. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. The gentleman from California, Ms. Lofgren, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there's been a lot of discussion on a lot of topics today. I noted that the chairman took the opportunity to discuss health care. And since we don't get you in front of us that often, I'm going to raise an issue that's not Fast and Furious. That's the Second Amendment. There's an amendment that comes before that, and that's the First Amendment, and that's the subject of my inquiry. As you know, for over a year, ICE and the Department of Justice have been seizing domain names of hundreds of websites on allegations of criminal copyright and trademark infringement. One particular domain name was seized a year ago, November of 2010. It's thejazz1.com, a very popular blog that was dedicated to hip-hop music. Just today, the news is that, and with the details, that the seizure, which I thought raised troubling questions at the time about the government's conduct in the case, and really raises questions about constitutional rights of due process and free speech as they apply to websites. After the government seized the domain name, its owner filed a request for the government to return it to them. And under the law, the government has 90 days to initiate a full forfeiture proceeding against the domain, or else it has to return the property. However, in this case, the deadline passed with no action, and when the website's lawyer asked with your department's lawyers, he was told the government had filed an extension with the court entirely under seal and without notice to him. They had no notice, they had no opportunity to respond, and when the lawyer, of course this is according to the news reports, asked for any sort of proof that the extension had actually existed, your department's lawyers reportedly said he would just have to trust them. The government then claimed to have received 2 additional extensions under the same process without notice, without a hearing, and they refused to release the court order according to the press reports. And then as of today, the last extension was filed, and the government finally admitted that it did not have probable cause for the forfeiture, and the domain name was returned to the website owners today. In short, a blog site, which is identical in terms of First Amendment protections to a newspaper or a magazine, has the same First Amendment rights, was shut down for an entire year by the government, by our government, with no due process, no contested hearings, no written orders. And I just think this, I mean, if these reports are true, that's just an outrageous violation of the First Amendment. So my question is, I assume that you believe that the First Amendment doesn't allow the government to go in and shut down the press for a year, prior restraint on speech without any kind of due process. I guess this is a question. Do you think that's consistent with the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments to the Constitution? And if the facts, I'll give you the article that I just read today, if the facts are as reported in this article, what will you do to make sure that the wrongdoers in your department are no longer in your department? I mean, there has to be a sanction for someone to do such a thing. If we did this to a magazine, if we went and locked the doors and put a sign and said closed and refused to deal with them for a year, people would be outraged. But since it's a blog, and since it's hip-hop artists, I mean, you know, it seems to me the hip-hop artists have every much right to due process and to the First Amendment as any other American. So could you comment on that, Attorney General?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the reason why that domain name was seized or the facts of this case. I will certainly look into that, and we'll get back to you with whatever information we can. I mean, you're right. I mean, what the subject matter is of a particular blog, you know, is obviously entitled to First Amendment protection. There may be other reasons why this was seized. I just don't know. I can tell you that my daughters are watching this hearing, having heard about this hip-hop issue now. I will hear about this from them.
Very good.
At home, and if nothing else, I will make sure that I stay in touch with these folks to get you an answer. My daughters will be on me about this.
Well, I wonder if you could give a commitment that if the facts are as we've outlined, that you will take appropriate action within your department to make sure that those who violated the law in the DOJ are dealt with, and that this, you know, becomes a well-known, a sanctionable type of activity in your department.
We'll certainly look at it. My hope would be that there is a reason, an acceptable reason why these actions have occurred, if they have been accurately described, and but to the extent that somebody has acted inappropriately in the department, I'll make sure that they are held accountable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Lofgren. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General, for being here. I guess just to lay the groundwork here, you understand that perhaps the reason that this issue has gotten so much attention is that in the simplicity of the overall project here, it appears that the American government, the American Justice Department of Justice, through their department and subsidiaries, have orchestrated a program to get American gun dealers to sell guns to straw buyers, to then run those guns to Mexico and give them to drug cartels, around 2,000 high-powered weapons, with the understanding that that takes grave risk for innocent human life. I mean, at this point, we know that at least one of our own agents was killed, and probably 150 or more Mexican citizens were killed. Now, that's a pretty scary scenario by itself. But I think the thing that would really concern the American people is why this was all done. Now, on the one hand, if it was just something that was, you know, sincere effort that went wrong or was just gross incompetence, so that's one thing. But Mr. Issa mentioned some internal emails that I think were pretty significant, because if the American people learned that the motivations for all of this was somehow to make a case to deprive them of their Second Amendment rights, or to make a case to further the department's ability to further regulate gun rights within the United States, that would make them very angry, General. And so let me just read a couple of the emails again. I know that Mr. Issa has already done this, but I just want to be clear on this so that you understand why some of us are so concerned. On July 14, 2010, the ATF headquarters received an update on Fast and Furious, and the Assistant Director, Mark Chait, emailed Bill Newell, the head of the ATF's Phoenix office. Quote, Bill, can you see if these guns were all purchased from the same licensed gun dealer and at one time? We're looking at anecdotal cases to support a demand letter on long gun multiple sales. Thanks. In other words, they were trying to use this tragedy to build a case for these demand letters. Well done yesterday, Bill. In light of our request for demand letter 3, this case could be a strong supporting factor if we determine how many multiple sales of long guns occurred during the course of this case. And it appears that the ATF was trying to rely on walked guns orchestrated by the department to justify its new long gun reporting requirement known as Demand Letter 3. Well, the people would be very upset. Is that true? Now, you've already testified that you hadn't read these emails. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, that I haven't read?
You already told Mr. Issa that you hadn't actually read these emails.
Right. That's correct.
Well, you know, the thing that is difficult for me, General, is that you then told him that it was out of context. And how would you have known that it was out of context if you hadn't read them? I mean, what would give you the first indication that they were out of context?
Because he read part of the email to me, and I was able to listen to that, and understanding what he said or what he read from the email, and knowing what happened here, as I explained.
All right, I'll accept that. But do you read? I know you said that you don't oftentimes read letters from your own staff. Do you read major letters from oversight chairmen like Mr. Issa and Mr. Grassley that come to your office? Do you personally read these letters?
I can certainly say that over the last few months, everything that Mr. Issa has sent, that Senator Grassley has sent, I have read.
Well, let me just say then to you, on July 12th, 2011, which was a letter that they both sent to you, the emails I just read to you were attached to the letter.
Well, I might not have read the attachments then. You know, I mean, I understand something. I mean, these things come in. I read these things from Mr. Issa, from Congressman Issa, from Senator Grassley, because I take seriously the.
It's hard for me to. But anyway, let me skip one more. Ask you one more question here. Mr. Issa had also asked if you had given all the pertinent emails here, and that he noted that none of them had your name on them. None of them. And you've said that, you know, this obviously is probably one of the most significant scandals facing your tenure over the Justice Department. And not one email, General, was from you, or, you know, not one of them?
Well, we have produced a really substantial amount of stuff around the February 4th letter. But let me just be very clear that with regard to documents that go beyond that from February the 5th on, those materials have not been produced, and it is not our intention to produce them following that.
So the answer to his question would have been no, that you haven't given him all of the pertinent emails. And I guess it just is very simple in my mind that either, if there are no emails from you that have been given to Mr. Issa, if there are none regarding this committee, then we're left with three options here. Either this is not that big a deal to you, and I know that it is, or somehow you, for particular reasons, don't write emails so that there can't be any record, or that you haven't given us those emails. Now, that's the only three things I can come up with. There may be other possibilities. I'm open to hear it.
Well, I made an exception to the way in which the Justice Department has always conducted itself with the provision of these materials around that February 4th letter, and acted in a way with regard to all other email material in the way that all other attorneys general before me have. And on that basis, there are emails, materials that we have not and will not produce.
I understand.
Yet following
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I understand, Mr. General, and I appreciate it. But that answers the question, and I appreciate that, because without insulting you, that's one of the first clear answers I've gotten today, is that you've agreed that you haven't given the chairman all of the pertinent emails, and you're saying you're not going to. So at least that's a clear answer for all of us. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Franks. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For those of you keeping score at home, one side is using this horrible screw-up to justify a policy. The other side is using this horrible screw-up to justify not funding ATF, not giving the ATF a leader, continuing to make tracing difficult of guns, continuing to make releasing statistics difficult, and for allowing continued extraordinarily lax policies for the violators and the purchasers of straw weapons that will be used long after this hearing today to purchase weapons to endanger Mexicans and Americans and our DEA agents. Penalties that were described in hearings before this Congress as nothing more than a moving violation. So, Mr. Attorney General, now that I've got the scorecard up to date, let me just congratulate you. I can't forget that I'm from Chicago, and yet again, yesterday there was a sentencing of an Illinois governor. So we will have 2 in jail at the same time. 4 of the last 8 governors, 2 of my last 4 predecessors in this office went to jail or are going to jail. So I want to commend your office for its work. I just wish we didn't give you so much work to do. But toward that end, Mr. Sensenbrenner and I did manage to get a bill out of this committee dealing with repairing honest services, and I'd like your reaction on where we need to go on that. As you know, the Supreme Court struck down that act, many provisions of it, and they are a necessary tool. So given where we are in Chicago but across the country, you know, where in your mind do we need to go to deal with official corruption?
Well, I think that I thank you for the compliment. It's not something that I should be complimented for, but the men and women in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago deserve all the credit. Pat Fitzgerald is a great U.S. attorney. He's a friend. He's done a wonderful job over a great number of years there, and he's got a great staff. And I also appreciate the efforts that you and Congressman Sensenbrenner the efforts that you have made in trying to help us deal with that Supreme Court decision. The honest services the honest services provision in Title 18 is a vital tool for us to have as we try to fight official corruption cases. A number of cases over the years have been made on the basis of the use of that provision, and to the extent that we can work with Congress to have that provision formed in a way that it can withstand constitutional muster, that will help us. It will give us another tool in our arsenal against official corruption, which is a priority for this administration.
And obviously the bill has not passed the full House or the Senate. To the extent that your agency can or will participate in making sure that we do this right, as we'd like this one to stand up for some time, we'd certainly appreciate your help in that matter.
We would be glad to work with you in that regard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. General, the way I see the Fast and Furious operation, based on all the information that I've received, is that the United States government, Justice Department, ATF, we're aware of a situation where guns could be bought in the United States, serious weapons, automatic, semi-automatic, sniper rifles, bought by straw purchasers and were observed by federal authorities, wanted to watch the guns go to Mexico, go to the drug cartels, and see where they ended up. Here's how it ended up. 2,000 weapons, based upon the information that we've received from your department. 600 of those weapons are accounted for. The vast majority are not accounted for. We don't know what country they're in and who's got them. But this operation is serious to me because people died with this ill-founded decision. We talk about the two Americans, the two agents, one Brian Terry, Jaime Zapata in Mexico, the two agents, but at least 200 Mexican nationals died too because of the United States watching these weapons, knowing where they were going, and lose those weapons. Mexican government that hasn't said a whole lot about this other than at least 200 Mexican nationals. Those Mexican nationals that were murdered because of our watching this illegal conduct are just as important as the two Americans that were murdered as well. And that's why this is a serious discussion. You're the Attorney General, you're a lawyer, former judge, prosecutor, you're the head guy in the United States when it comes to the Justice Department and law enforcement. My understanding is you didn't really know about the operation. The memos, you might have gotten the memo, didn't read the memo, or didn't read all the memo, not sure about that. But you're the person in charge of this, and believing that you were unaware of Operation Fast and Furious requires, to coin a phrase, a willing suspension of disbelief. It's hard for me to believe that you were unaware of this operation that went to Mexico. Now, my question is very simple. Who is the person in the United States government that made the decision of an Operation Fast and Furious to facilitate the guns going to Mexico? Who is that one person?
We don't know yet.
So you don't know who was responsible for the conduct of these thousands of guns going to Mexico? We don't know who that is?
We know that the case was opened in the ATF office in Phoenix a month or so before it was opened in the U.S. Attorney's office in Phoenix. We know that it was given OCDETF status sometime after that. But we do not know as yet who the particular person was, to the extent it is a person, in either of those offices that said this is the way in which this operation, this flawed operation, should be conducted.
So we don't know the person that signed off. I mean, I don't know how the federal government works. Everybody's got to sign off on something, especially something like this. But we don't know who that person is yet. Is that what you're telling me?
With all due respect, I'd be surprised if we're going to see a document that somebody signed off on that said you can let guns walk. I'd be surprised if we see something like that.
Would you agree that?
But I don't know. I don't know.
We don't know. We don't know who was in charge of making that final. It's time to send the guns to the enemy of Mexico, the drug dealers, which is phenomenal to me. It's a violation, I understand, of international law to allow gun trafficking to go between two countries. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it would depend. I mean, as you look at
people in one country are smuggling guns to another country. Isn't that a violation of international law?
Well, I don't know, but international. I was going to say, if you look at Operation Wide Receiver, if the governments agree that weapons can go from one country to another, I would not think that violates international law.
If they agree. That's the key.
Right.
Did the Mexican government agree to Operation Fast and Furious?
Not the way in which it was, not in the way it was actually carried out.
The way it turned out.
Way it turned out.
Would you agree this operation was reckless? It's a reckless operation on the part of the United States?
I mean, I think the way it was carried out, I would certainly say it was flawed, reckless. Yeah, I'd probably agree with that. I mean, it was done inappropriately and it's had tragic consequences and is going to, as I've said in my opening statement, it's going to continue to have tragic consequences.
More people are going to die, probably.
Unfortunately, I think that's probably true.
If a person recklessly causes the death of another person under many state law, including Texas, where some of these guns were bought, it's manslaughter. It's a crime. And it's my belief that if the United States government helped facilitate reckless homicide, reckless killing of other people, this is a serious matter. And there may be people in our government, Justice Department, the ATF, that if they help facilitate reckless conduct that caused the death of an individual in the United States or in Mexico by sending these guns down there, they should be held criminally responsible for that conduct. Are you going as far as the Attorney General to make sure that if criminal violations were committed by anyone in our government, that you're going to prosecute those people?
Sure. If we find that there were criminal violations connected to the conduct of Fast and Furious, I will commit that we will take those findings seriously and that people will be prosecuted. Now, when I said reckless before, I was talking about the way in which the operation itself was conducted. I don't want to cast too wide a net here and say that on the basis of what we know now, that there is a basis to conclude that people connected to Fast and Furious, either at the ATF in Phoenix or in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Phoenix, would necessarily have the requisite state of mind or done things that would bring them under the ambit.
Reclaiming my time. I know that's not what you're saying. That's what I was saying. I was saying
the gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you very much. And I request unanimous consent to submit further questions to the Attorney General and have answers in writing.
Without objection. Thank you, Mr. Poe. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. True, is recognized.
Mr. Attorney General, before I begin with my questions, I'd like to thank you for the anti-crime accomplishments in my district of Los Angeles. Earlier this year, the department took down in one day more than 100 members and associates of transnational organized crime groups that were involved in widespread criminal conduct in Los Angeles, Miami, and Denver. These were violent and fraud-related crimes, including kidnapping and drug distribution. And also, in recent years, the department has gone after a San Gabriel Valley-based organization linked to a major ecstasy ring, leading to the seizure of over 1.1 million ecstasy tablets. Your office is also engaged in a massive takedown of major methamphetamine and cocaine suppliers to some of the most violent street gangs in Los Angeles and La Puente. So I thank you for all of those efforts. It has truly helped our area. And I'd also like to commend you for the work your department's done in regards to voter rights. Your office has handled 27 new cases this year and opened up 172 investigations in this area. We all know there's been a large number of unprecedented legislation suppressing voter rights, and I'm happy to hear that your office is vigilant about not letting that happen. Can you provide some examples of what the department is doing to ensure that newly enacted state legislative efforts on voter identification are implemented in accordance with the Voting Rights Act?
Well, we have a special role to play under the Voting Rights Act, our Civil Rights Division. which is ably led by Tom Perez, has been very active in this regard. And to the extent that changes are made in covered jurisdictions, we review those proposed changes, and where we think something runs afoul of the Voting Rights Act, we note that and do not pass on them. Where we think that they are consistent with the Voting Rights Act, we approve them. We have taken in a number of places lodged objections to proposals that have been made with regard to changes in voting schemes.
And what steps are being taken to ensure that jurisdictions and their public are aware of what is permissible and not permissible with these types of laws?
Well, you know, we've tried to, Assistant Attorney General Perez in particular has spent a lot of time on the road trying to educate people, especially in those areas covered by the Voting Rights Act, about, and we've interacted with state officials as well to let them know about ways in which things can be changed consistent with the Voting Rights Act, warn jurisdictions about ways in which changes might be made that might run afoul of the Voting Rights Act, and then more generally to talk to members of the public, as I have tried to do when I've been out there, to talk about the Voting Rights Act. As I said, I'm going to be talking about in a speech at the LBJ Library next week, I think on Monday or Tuesday.
Very good. Well, I want to also thank you for something else, which is that there is an issue about offensive materials about Muslims that was used in some FBI training. And I know that in the Senate Judiciary meeting last month, you acknowledged that this has stopped. It was when the FBI was conducting counterterrorism training using materials that included inflammatory statements about Islamic beliefs and offensive stereotypes about Muslims. So at that Senate Judiciary meeting, you acknowledged that it stopped. And I would like to know what the status is of the situation and the steps that have been taken, or any investigation that's been opened up about the use of these biased trainers and materials.
Well, the person who was responsible for the use of, I guess, using that material is no longer going to be used by the FBI. We've also enhanced our efforts to make sure that we review all the materials that are used in the training of agents, lawyers, personnel within the Department of Justice, to make sure that that kind of mistake doesn't happen again. This is something that the FBI director, the heads of the other law enforcement agencies within the department, as well as I and the leadership in the department, are committed to making sure does not happen again. I mean, that was totally inappropriate, and it's a mistake that we will not allow to happen again.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks you, Ms. Chu. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, is recognized.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Attorney General, for being here. Have you spoken to Secretary Napolitano about Fast and Furious?
No.
Have you spoken with Secretary Clinton about Fast and Furious?
No.
Have you spoken to President Obama about Fast and Furious?
I don't think that I have. I see the President.
That's okay. If you haven't, you haven't. Have you spoken to the President of Mexico about Fast and Furious?
No.
Have you spoken to the Attorney General of Mexico about Fast and Furious?
I don't believe so.
You have routinely argued that you've been oblivious and disengaged in this operation, and I buy that to a large extent.
I'm not sure I can.
But we have a dead Border Patrol agent in Agent Terry. We have 2,000 missing guns. We have 200 deaths in Mexico. We had dead government officials in Mexico. We have a Mexican helicopter with troops in it that shot, 3 of which are wounded, back in May of this year. We have 50-plus members of Congress calling for your resignation over this, and you've never spoken to any one of these people about this operation.
Well, first off, the notion that I am somehow oblivious to this matter is totally belied by these inconvenient things called the facts.
You took 5 days to go to the Caribbean. You didn't have 15 minutes to call Secretary Clinton, Napolitano, talk to the President, or your counterparts in Mexico?
Understand something with regard to Secretary Napolitano. Our agencies have been in constant touch with each other about this issue because we are engaged, both of us, in the prosecution of the killer of.
Okay, so if you were intimately involved and engaged in this, remember, Agent Terry was killed in December, mid-December, and then we had Jaime Zapata, who was killed in Mexico. 2 officers shot in February 15th. On February 16th, you and Secretary Napolitano issued a press release. It's titled, Secretary Napolitano and Attorney General Holder form a joint task force to assist Mexico's investigation into yesterday's shooting of 2 ICE agents in Mexico. At the very beginning of this press release, Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano and Attorney General Eric Holder today met to discuss this issue. And how is it that you and Secretary Napolitano said you never even talked or discussed, even brought up or had any discussion about Fast and Furious?
The press release that you talk about is not a Fast and Furious matter.
But
so you have to understand something, the way Washington works here, okay? The reality is that when it comes to matters that are under investigation.
But the death of Jaime Zapata was highly likely, that came from Fast and Furious. In fact, from testimony that we took from Agent Forcelli, and I'm going to read from this, is from January 8th of 2011, quote, and there was this sense, like every other time, even with Miss Gifford's shooting, there was a state of panic, like, oh my God, let's hope that this is not a weapon from that case. And the shooting of Mr. Zapata down in Mexico, I know that, again, that state of panic that they had, like, please let this not come back. So the agents on the ground were so concerned that this is going to happen. You and Secretary Napolitano have a discussion, and there's no discussion about even the possibility of Fast and Furious?
There is the meaningful conversations that happen between DHS and DOJ happen at lower levels between investigators.
But when you and Secretary, what did you and Secretary Napolitano talk about if you didn't talk about Fast and Furious, and it's the day after Jaime Zapata, and you were very quick to issue press releases?
Well, you're making an assumption that that in fact is a Fast and Furious case. I'm not sure that
We didn't know at the time. You didn't know at the time. I didn't know. Nobody knew at the time. Isn't it a reasonable assumption to suggest that it may have been guns from Fast and Furious that happened, that caused that death?
Given the fact that there are, over the course of the last 5 years, 64,000 weapons that have gone from the United States to Mexico.
I have a hard time believing, Mr. Attorney General, with all due respect, my time is short. Twice, the President of the United States has gone before the American people and said that you had nothing to do with this, you weren't involved in it, you weren't engaged in it, yet you said you've never spoken to the President. How is it that he would know that you haven't been involved, you weren't involved in this, and he can make such a claim if you've never even spoken to him about it?
Well, the President gets information from the Justice Department in a variety of ways. We interact with the White House counsel's office very frequently. I don't know exactly what the flow of information is within the White House, but he can find out about my state of involvement in matters connected to the Justice Department without speaking directly to
Let me move on to you have access to, obviously, the emails of Dennis Burke. On Wednesday, November 24th, 2010, he sent an email. It said, quote, some of the weapons bought by these clowns in Arizona have been directly traced to murders of elected officials in Mexico by the cartels. So, Katie, bar the door when we unveil this baby, end quote. How is it that you've never had a discussion with your counterpart in Mexico about this? In fact, in Los Angeles Times article dated September 19th of this year, quote, at no time did we know or were we made aware that there might have been arms trafficking permitted. In no way would we have allowed it because of an attack on the safety of Mexicans. It goes on in the article, actually the paragraph before, and to this date, she said, U.S. officials have not briefed her on the operation gone awry, nor have they apologized. What is unacceptable is that you and everybody in your organization, according to you at the higher-ups, know about this investigation. You don't have 15 minutes to pick up the phone, and we have still never talked to these people in order to solve this problem, because, as you say, it's going to go on for some time.
We have taken steps, I have taken steps to solve this problem in that I've ordered an examination of this to determine exactly what happened. I have issued directives that this should never happen again. We have put in place measures at ATF so that this kind of thing won't happen again. What Todd Jones has done with regard to the reforms that he has put in place, I think, are going to be extremely effective. And I've made personnel changes with regard to...
You haven't fired anybody. Nobody's been fired.
The gentleman's time has expired. Does the gentleman want to respond to the last question?
I just was trying to say that I have made personnel changes with regard to the agencies that have been involved, and these are initial determinations that I have made. It is not all that I am possibly going to do. There is an impatience here, and in some ways I understand it, but the reality is that you have to do these things on the basis of evidence, on the basis of findings that are factually grounded. And when I am in that position, I will take the appropriate action. But I want to assure you and the American people that people will be held accountable for the mistakes that were made in Fast and Furious.
Okay. Thank you,
Mr. Chairman, point of inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Chaffetz. Who seeks to be recognized? Gentleman from California.
A point of inquiry. Do political appointees of the President's and the Attorney General serve at the pleasure of the President or the Attorney General, or do they need to have to be fired for cause?
That is not actually a parliamentary inquiry, though.
But I'm sure inquiring.
Though it may be a legitimate question.
Thank you, Mr.
The
Chairman.
Judiciary Committee will recess until immediately after the series of votes. We expect that to be about 2:30.
Yes. Y'all be back here. Hey, dismiss your shot.
Now that we know that ATF apparently skewed the statistics, particularly about long gun sales, will these statistics be scrapped or abandoned?
I don't know if that, in fact, is true, but the 2,000 weapons or so that were involved in Fast and Furious should not be counted as part of that overall number. And to the extent that that is true, we would pull them out. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, General, have you implemented any policy to end programs such as Fast and Furious? And if these changes, are they permanent or temporary?
Well, as I said, in addition to the things that Todd Jones has put in place that deals with certainly the problems that are, I think, most egregious about ATF, he talks about the way in which surveillance has to occur when you are monitoring trafficking, gun trafficking operations. I released in March of this year a field directive through the Deputy Attorney General that indicated that gun walking, as we've come to call that practice, is prohibited, and made sure that every agent in the Justice Department, every prosecutor in the Justice Department understands that. So it is clear that gun walking is not acceptable, was never acceptable, but is certainly not acceptable after my policy pronouncement in March of this year.
Well, the General Holder, earlier this year, August, I believe, you named Todd Jones as the new director of ATF. This appears irregular because he currently continues to serve as U.S. Attorney for that area in Minnesota, while at the same time, he's wearing two hats, in other words. Am I missing the mark, or is this irregular?
Yeah, it is irregular. I mean, we have a nominee, a very qualified person who could be the head of ATF. I thought a management change was necessary at ATF, and in the absence of a confirmed head, I had to go with who I thought was best for the organization. Todd's a very experienced prosecutor. He's a great U.S. attorney, but you're right. He is, in fact, wearing two hats. He's working extremely hard, but I think he's made meaningful changes at ATF. He has lifted morale. He has put in place a set of regulations that would prevent the mistakes from the flawed Fast and Furious operation, I think, from ever occurring again. But you're right. It is irregular, and given my druthers, I would rather have a confirmed permanent head at ATF.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my red light has illuminated, so I will yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Coble. Another gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Watt, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I had hoped the way my colleague from North Carolina started his questioning that we were going to treat this as a general oversight hearing, which is the way my memo said it would.
Whether it's after the Civil War, the enfranchisement of women, we have always tried to make it easy, and I'm concerned that these recent efforts are going to have a negative impact. And I think ultimately that's not good for our democracy. We want as many people as we can to have their voices heard in the most important way, and that's by casting votes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Watt. The gentleman from California, Mr. Gallagher, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, General Holder. General, I continue to hear from ICE agents, many ICE agents, that they are frustrated that they've had significant difficulty with U.S. attorneys prosecuting worksite enforcement cases. Can you give us specific, and I want to emphasize the word specific, data regarding the number of prosecutions DOJ have accepted and how many they've declined?
Well, if you'll allow me to respond to that after the hearing in a written fashion, I'm sure I can come up with some numbers, but I don't have those numbers.
I can completely understand that, but I would, for the sake of the record of this hearing, appreciate that information as soon as you get it to us. As everyone clearly understands, welfare fraud is playing a major role in our ability to continue providing service, the level of service that's necessary in Medicare. And the fact that fraud is playing a significant threat as it relates to the solvency of that fund. There have been several estimates that exceed well in excess of $60 billion annually in fraud, and I'm sure you're aware of that. There's also evidence that organized crime, including gangs from Russia and other Eastern European countries and other places as well, that they're finding that filing fraudulent claims is a fast and quick way to make a lot of money, and most of that money is going offshore. Can you give us any detail as to what DOJ is doing in prosecuting these offenders and working with local law enforcement? I've met with my local people in the Los Angeles area. They're very frustrated. How much effort is really being put into, and what success are you having with dealing with the issue of Medicare fraud?
Well, Congressman, you're right to point that out as an issue that is of great concern. It is one that we have tried to focus our attention on. We work with our partners at HHS. Secretary of HHS Sebelius and I have been
going to be rather than an inquiry into one single subject. So I want to spend my time asking about some other things unrelated to Fast and Furious. Because there are a number of other important things going on in life, and some of those things the Attorney General and his staff have made tremendously good decisions about. One of those is to have all these police chiefs sitting behind you today, one of whom is from my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. And for the members on the Democratic side, at least, they will certainly get to know Chief Rodney Monroe when they come to Charlotte for the Democratic National Convention. So I want to applaud the work that he is doing to prepare us for that significant national event. Perhaps the police chief from Tampa is behind you also. I don't know him. He'll be doing that counterpart work for the Republicans at the Republican National Convention, but that is a massive, massive undertaking. And I know that the Attorney General's office, the Department of Justice, Secret Service, all of the federal authorities are working well based on everything I have heard to prepare for those big security events, and I want to say publicly how much I applaud that. Second, there are a number of things going on an issue that we are dealing with or trying to deal with in this committee, dealing with online piracy. We have some proposed legislation. I won't ask you to comment on that, but I would ask you to comment briefly on the extent of the problem and briefly on what the Department of Justice is doing to try to combat online privacy until we can get the bill passed. And I say comment briefly because I got one other subject that I want to get to related to redistricting and voter suppression and the pre-clearance process under the Voting Rights Act. Perhaps those issues, voter suppression in particular, may not be as important to some of my colleagues on this committee as fast and furious and guns, but for a number of people in this country who would like to have the opportunity to vote, they are very serious issues. So why don't I just ask you to comment on what's happening in both of those areas, online piracy and the voter suppression, redistricting, and pre-clearance process.
Okay. We have been, I think, very aggressive with regard to our law enforcement efforts concerning intellectual property concerns. In February 2010, I established the Department's task force on intellectual property. I traveled to China, I guess sometime last year, was at the White House, I think 2 weeks or so ago, to announce a program where I cut some radio spots in addition to television spots that were done by others to talk about the whole question of piracy. And I think we have to understand the significance of it. It is a moral and legal problem there, but it's also a job killer. When things like intellectual property are stolen by other countries, by people in this country inappropriately, it costs jobs. It inhibits creativity. And so we have looked at it in a variety of ways. I work with Victoria Espinel, who heads up the White House effort in this regard, and this is a priority item for us. I'd certainly like to work with you with regard to the bill that you mentioned and see if we can come up with a way in which we put more teeth into our enforcement efforts. With regard to the whole question of voter suppression and challenges, we have filed a number of lawsuits with regard to changes under covered districts covered by the Voting Rights Act. I actually will be giving a speech at the LBJ Library on Monday and talking about this in a more fulsome way. The Justice Department has a responsibility under the Voting Rights Act to look at proposed changes in voting schemes that are in areas covered by the Voting Rights Act, and there's only so much I can say there because we have to act in a neutral way, or almost act as judges in that regard. I can tell you, though, that I am concerned about some of the things that I have seen, without getting into specifics about any one. I was a prosecutor in the public integrity section, and I actually investigated and prosecuted voter fraud cases when I was a young prosecutor, and I'm concerned that some of these changes go far beyond that which exists in terms of vote fraud. I think we need to have some kind of notion of proportionality, and the arc that we have seen over the course of this country has always been to increase the number of people who have the ability to vote.
The Judiciary Committee will come to order, and the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coble, is recognized for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, General.
Good morning.
General, the FBI, as you know, operates under Attorney General guidelines for most or all of their investigative activities. The objective of these guidelines is the full utilization of all authorities in investigative matters consistent with the Constitution and the laws of the United States. It furthermore ensures that activities must be lawful and reasonable and respect liberty and privacy and avoid unnecessary intrusion into the lives of law-abiding citizens. They enable the FBI to perform its duties with effectiveness, certainty, and confidence. The purpose of these guidelines, it appears apparent, is to establish consistent policy in such matters. General, does the ATF and/or other Department of Justice law enforcement components operate under these guidelines?
There are general guidelines that exist within the department and that control the activities of the various investigative agencies that are part of the department, the Marshal Service, the DEA, the ATF, and the FBI. There might be some that apply specifically to the FBI, given its unique mission with regard to counterterrorism and intelligence, that might not apply to the other components.
I think you may have already answered this one, but are they identical guidelines for identical investigative activity, or may one agency do something that another cannot do under similar circumstances? And if they differ, how do they differ from the guidelines that the FBI, under which the FBI operates?
There are general guidelines that handle or control the way in which investigations are to occur. And for instance, if we're looking at Fast and Furious, those are outside the guidelines certainly that apply to ATF, but they would also be outside the guidelines that would apply to the Drug Enforcement Administration, to the FBI as well. And one of the things that we have tried to do in this reform of ATF and under the leadership of Todd Jones is come up with a whole set of new policy changes and recommendations and rules with regard to how ATF itself can handle and conduct certain investigations.
General, if I had two words to describe Fast and Furious, it would be reckless at best and a disaster at worst. But firearms, I'm told, sold under the Fast and Furious program were included in ATF statistics on the retail sale of firearms and related regulations.